this podcast, we're going to break down a little bit of what John Tozzi went through in the most recent episode that we had and the PDF that we developed with him.
It's really important that you know what your signs are for, hey, I'm getting close to burnout.
If you are not self-aware, everything's going to fall apart.
It becomes a real challenge to make a hard line between, am I studying to preach or am I studying to understand?
If all you're basing your decisions on are the metrics involved, you better make sure that those metrics are what's really going to move the needle forward. More often than not, money is not the metric that you're basing your decisions on.
C.S. Lewis has this thought. He says, if God forgives us, we ought to forgive ourselves as well. Otherwise, we set ourselves up as a higher tribunal than him. In other words, if we are forgiven by God and refuse to forgive ourselves, we're putting ourselves in a place of higher authority.
We're just like reframing the way that the word church is used. A quick pause before we go any further. If this conversation is already resonating with you, it would really help us if you like, follow, or subscribe to the show. This isn't for the algorithms, but it tells us that this kind of thinking is actually helpful for you. I was watching this guy, and I didn't like his content, to be honest, because I thought it was a little church bashing. But the name of his content channel was, he goes around basically exposing churches as businesses rather than as churches. And I think it's a really semantic view of like the word church. For some people, realistically, they do need to readjust what their version of church is. But for others, it's like you're coming after people that are literally using tax code correctly in order to further the gospel. What's the problem with that? Like churches are businesses. Like that's, if you think about like it's like using the word love and it has 4 different meanings in Greek. It doesn't mean that church as a whole, like just because church has multiple meanings to the same word doesn't mean that one is wrong and one is right. But giving context to which version of church you're talking about. Are you talking about like the church, the body that's referenced in the Bible? Or are you talking about church, the industry of nonprofits that's in America today? Like those are 2 different things, but they're not, neither one is wrong, but it is wrong whenever you confuse the 2. And the guy is just kind of berating a lot of nonprofits and churches, and he released it on Amazon or something. He's berating a lot of these Christian leaders because they're utilizing tax code correctly. And there's a couple, there are shady practices in church and nonprofits. That's normal. That happens. You have to figure that out. And I think that's probably where his heart started, was to go after that. But it feels like it's turned into anti-church, even though he's saying he's not anti-church. And he's but he created a platform that's kind of like the 99, like the Guide Star, but more open book, I guess you could say, where everybody completely posts their church financial dealings on there to be open, and then people can fundraise through that platform. And for me, I'm like, aren't you doing the exact same thing that you're getting onto churches about? Like, if I had a church called The Good Shepherd and I decided that I wanted to also create a software for that and then sell it or use it for open source church donating, same thing you're doing. You just happen to have a business or a for-profit instead of a nonprofit.
Well, it's like, how are we going to criticize somebody for correctly stewarding the things that they're meant to be stewarding? You know what I mean? It's not like money's not going to be involved no matter what. So if it has to be involved, how are we going to use it in a way that benefits us the most so that we can do what we're trying to do? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, exactly. It made me like really angry watching it. Like at first I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is good content he had. And then as it went on, I was like, I don't agree with a lot of this. Like it didn't sit well with me. And I'm not like the number one pro-prosperity preacher gospel, but I do believe God wants us to prosper. And I think that people's understanding of that is different depending on what denomination you're in. And he was like really bashing like the people themselves, the leaders themselves. And that I wasn't like really behind. Like it's one thing to say like the organization as a whole needs to adjust, or we need to refocus what the word church means in American culture, or we need to be more open about our financial dealings. Like that's one thing. But then to like purposely single out certain ministries whenever you're supposed to be building the body, it's like that it felt like a good intention, but a bad action.
Yeah, it's just like you cross over from right questioning of somebody's theology into like an ad hominem sort of attack where it's like, okay, yeah, I get it. You don't agree with them. That's fine. There's plenty of people I don't agree with, but then to berate someone or belittle them or, cast dispersions on their character or what they're trying to do or what they mean to be doing, I feel like that's it's kind of an overstep, you know?
Yeah. There's a lot of good, just because somebody has a little bit misview of theology in your opinion doesn't mean that what they're doing as a whole is wrong. I mean, the Bible's even clear about gifts operating without repentance, and we don't have any issue with a celebrity doing whatever they do in their lives. But whenever it comes to the church, it's like this whole people just get really angry. And I understand that in some cases you expect the church to be held to a higher standard. I mean, we talked about that before, but I think there needs to be some grace too for leaders. That everybody's just a human trying to figure out what to do in 80 years of life.
Right. If we're lucky.
Oh, I mean, plus or minus some years, but I mean, you got like 80 years, you're trying to figure it out. Nobody's perfect. So instead of like berating people, they're trying to at least push the love of Christ. Like, why don't you just stop? And if you really do have an issue or think that what they're doing is wrong, then go talk to them about it.
Yeah, biblically, you're supposed to take it to that person. You know what I mean? There's a senior pastor that I worked for in a big church. So it was like, there was not very much overlap between my day and his day. But his big thing was like not triangulating your issues with other people. And so he tells this story a lot. When he was taking over as senior pastor, there was the guy that was before him, and people were coming to him saying, hey, I don't like XYZ about this new guy. And he's like, well, have you talked to him about it? And they're, no. He's like, well, then why are you talking to me? Go talk to him about it. You know what I mean? And it's just like this whole, it's the biblical model of if you have an issue, you go to that person. And if there's like still no repentance, then you go with one or two witnesses. And then, you move from there. But I don't know, it's kind of cowardly, I feel like, to use a platform to say something bad about somebody on like, a large scale. But if it were to be a one-on-one conversation, it would probably look really, really different. What they call them, keyboard warriors.
Yeah. That's basically what it felt like. It's just like a made content instead of just doing it behind a keyboard.
Yeah.
And, some of the people he specifically talked about, maybe because I know them, maybe that's why I was a little bit more defensive. Like, I know them, I know their ministries, and I'm like, they're not perfect. They're not perfect people, but they're not as maliciously intended as you're making it out to be. Church is a business, and I know a lot of people will disagree with that in the comments. If people see this, but it is. I mean, everything's a business. If you take any sort of English course in college, they'll teach you that everything is an argument. Every paper you write is an argument. Everything that deals with money in, money out is a business. And you can put different tax codes on it, whether it's religious, nonprofit, for-profit, government, whatever it is you want to throw onto the overarching, filing of the entity. But everything's a business and money comes in and money goes out. And you have to have fundamentals to function. If you skip the fundamentals, you spoil the vine. I mean, that's the verse right there. I mean, small foxes spoil the vine, so it is.
That you let kind of slip through the cracks that end up making the biggest negative impact, essentially.
Yeah, it just really, it drove me the wrong way. I was just like, I don't want anybody thinking that somebody doesn't belong in the body of Christ just because they have a different viewpoint on theology. As long as you get the main thing, then the rest of that is semantics. You figure
Right. Yeah, there's a ton of people that I know and have worked with or been around, and I wouldn't necessarily do what they do or like how they do what they do. Like I would have a different method, a different delivery. I would emphasize different points, but I never question like their heart. You know what I mean? I never question their intentions behind their actions. I think that's the difference is just to like my wife and I talk about this all the time. One of the biggest things in marriage is just giving each other the benefit of the doubt. Like if you have something that hurts your feelings, it's kind of my responsibility, if my wife does something and I have to assume for the sake of our marriage that like it wasn't malicious. You know what I mean? It's like I know my wife, I know her character, I know that she's not trying to hurt my feelings on purpose. She was probably completely unaware of it. But if you cross that boundary and you cease to give people the benefit of the doubt of, just I don't know what their heart was or what their intention was then we become in the role of God there, right? Because the Bible says the man looks at the outward appearance, we can see the action, but God looks at the heart. God perceives their intention, and God perceives how they meant to act and what they meant to do through those actions. Like, if we take upon ourselves the role as judge of their intentions, we ourselves are in error, you know?
I have an operations company, and I'm thinking about things that we've gone through. That same topic's not Bible, but when you deal with staff and you deal with clients and something doesn't go right, people are really quick to throw character under the bus or to take it really emotional, especially when you're dealing with like an owner, something to go right or not to that what they thought something should go at to their standard, something didn't go to the standard that they wanted it to go to. And even as an employer, I have staff that sometimes miss the mark. But I always say, like in our employee handbook, I have in there that like trust is a core value. I have to believe that once you sign that you're going to work here, that I can trust you. So every decision I make is built on the fact that I'm assuming trust is here. Now, the military has a phrase that is trust but verify. And I think that's important. So you're not blindly trusting, but you're assuming trust to begin with. And then you verify, which is by the fruit, which is biblical. And you watch that over time. I think if people are listening and they're trying to figure out how do you navigate that, I think it's a really clear example of trust but verify. See what's happening and then watch the fruit. If we're talking about pastors and religious leaders, like we've been talking about, like a broad scale, you don't know. You're only seeing one piece of social media, one piece of platform, one version of them in the public.
Really, most of the time today, you're seeing what somebody else is saying about what they've said. I mean, it's so rare that anybody's going to see criticism and then follow it up with, well, what's the clip in context? What's he saying 5 minutes before? What's he saying 5 minutes after? It's so, so rare that anybody's going to look beyond. They're like, oh, well, Pastor so-and-so said that Jesus isn't really the Son of God. I'd be like, well, obviously, we're going to need to take a closer look at that. That is a broad claim. I think I need to have a deep dive for myself and see the context of that statement, because I was like, I've seen clips from this pastor in the past, and I have a feeling that that is probably not what they're actually saying or meaning to say. It's the
Exactly.
whole, I think you and I have talked about this, but it's the difference of like burden of clarity on the speaker versus listener in different cultures. And in the West, the burden is overwhelmingly on the speaker to make sure that the listener hears them very correctly. And I feel it should so much be the opposite, that anyone who's listening is trying their best to understand the speaker at their intended meaning. You know what I mean? As opposed to just trying to constantly poke holes. Where I used to do this thing with my little sister because it would stress her out and I thought it was really funny. But I'd be like, hey, do you like chicken or beef? And she'd be like, well, I like beef. And I was like, so like, what's wrong with chicken? She's like, well, I mean, like chicken's good too, you know? And I would just kind of keep putting her on the back foot. And she was a kid, so I could like, play this ping pong game with her verbally. We do that in society all the time. It's just like, I'm not saying I don't like chicken. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with chicken. You asked me if I prefer beef, and I said, yes, I prefer beef. It's like, just hear what the person is saying, hear what they need to be saying. I don't know. I feel like a lot of misunderstandings are very easily put to bed if we can just hear what the person means to say, as opposed to like all the things that they're not saying or all the things that we think they should have said instead. It's just exhausting.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're talking about is active listening. I mean, if we could just not think of what we're going to say before the other person's done talking, just go into it unbiased and just have a real conversation with people.
Yeah. And it's like, if we want to be the church, it's how do we continually give each other the benefit of the doubt so that we can put to bed discord before we reach it. You know what I mean? There are things that we should be doing proactively for the sake of peace amongst the body of Christ that I feel like is a lot neglected.
Yeah. Well, a real example just happened yesterday. I got a text from my director of operations, and we are having some internal staffing issues with them not hitting certain goals and not following up on some things that they should have that are under her. And so we were going back and forth on what do we do? How do we correct it? How do we fix the situation we're in? And she goes, I have to stop for a second and refocus. And I can't go into this just assuming that that they're being malicious intent. Or I can't go into this thinking that I'm just going to fire them. So I have to go into this repurpose to actively try to solve the situation and listen to all the pieces that are here and laid out before me. Oh, that was really, really good awareness on her part of how quickly we can just go into one track mind of I'm angry, I'm emotional, I'm frustrated, and I'm going to make this decision because you're making more problems for me rather than let me stop and evaluate. And if that's still the direction we need to go, then we still go that way, but really evaluating where things are at. And whenever we're talking about preachers, pastors, missionaries, ministry leaders, or even if they're not in church, just people who have a high platform because of who they are and what they're involved in, you don't know what's happening behind the scenes. All you're seeing is this piece of them. And if they have a marketing team, then you're seeing a very curated piece of them that is getting pushed out, whether that's to drive. I mean, in the world today, we work in marketing, and in the world today that we're in, divisive content wins. A push for polarizing topics is going to win. Clickbait, there's a reason that that's a word. You use like 5 seconds of somebody talking. You could go, you go to the Stephen Furtick video that went out for a while that was talking about cocaine in the church, and it would
I won't
took
go there.
off. It's like there's a whole polarizing topic. I mean, to be honest, I didn't go back and listen to the whole thing, but I didn't also form an opinion on it. But a lot of people did. You're seeing one piece of people, and within that, you're seeing one clip um, that's circulated with a lot of commentary under that. Just talking about social media right now. And if we're talking about some prosperity preachers, I'm just going to hit on those for a second because I think it's a big talking point for a lot of people. But prosperity preachers that have been around for decades, I don't know all of them, but I do know that at some point they got into ministry because they felt a calling from God to impact people. And then they felt like this was the topic that they needed to hit on. And you can take that theology however you want. But the reality is, like, if you have an issue with that, evaluate the heart of the person first before you just evaluate what's being said or what people are saying about them. I would honestly urge people to think about somebody who has been in ministry for 50 plus years, has a big platform, and think about the fact that social media hasn't been around that long. And so the pieces that you're seeing are only very small clips of their whole life of ministry. And so really take a second to look into those people, and whether that's prosperity or not, just before you're quick to judge, take a second and evaluate. If you don't want to take that second to evaluate, then don't form an opinion. You're not doing anybody a service by that.
Yeah. Well, and as much as we talk about this now, it's clearly always been an issue because Paul addresses this in like Philippians 1. And I'm paraphrasing this a little bit, but he's saying, what's the issue if there's a person who isn't a good person, but they're proclaiming the gospel? He's like, whether of good intention or bad, all that matters is that Christ be made known. So if God chooses to use this person who's corrupt and who's abusing the system for their own gain, but somebody gets saved because of it, I don't really care. The goal is that Christ be made known. And I know that that's like a very blasé almost kind of take on it. And I feel like a lot of people will be irritated with it, but I didn't say it. Paul said it. You know what I mean?
Well,
The
okay,
author of the,
to play devil's advocate on that for a second, what about the women who are following, is it Paul and Timothy, and proclaiming Christ, and then Paul like said, "Get away from me," or that story.
yeah, it was because she's practicing divination.
So,
Yeah.
what's the difference between this? From like a high level, they look very similar.
To me, I think I always kind of interpreted that passage as more of like she was a nuisance to Paul and Paul was irritated. You know what I mean? And then he cast the demon out of her, and then her owner is essentially mad at Paul because now she can't do witchcraft anymore because she's not possessed by a demon. I feel like honestly, Paul was irritated by the nuisance that you're creating because she was possessed by a demon, which I feel like is a whole other issue.
It is.
But the non-possessed proclaiming the gospel for the sake of bad or good intention, all that matters is Christ be made known.
The non-possessed proclaiming the gospel. Put that on a t-shirt. The non-possessed.
Yeah.
That's funny. Okay, no, that's a good breakdown. I think because that comes up a lot in, I don't know, at least in the circles that I'm in, with when do you kind of challenge what somebody's saying if they're saying it's from God, but it doesn't feel right. And so some people would equate that to, I think the difference that you're talking about, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the difference you're talking about is whenever it comes from a presupposition bias about what's being said as opposed to the reality of what's happening, and being able to discern between what's bias and what's true. Those two things both said by Paul would feel at a top level, 30,000 foot level, they would feel the same. You saw somebody doing something and they were both saying that Jesus was great. And so it's like, well, if the bad intentions are there, then that's fine. And the other one's like, well, she was possessed by a demon, so bad intentions were there, so that should be fine. But it's whenever you have it in full context. But a lot of leaders are missing is full context, whether that's your staff, if you're just talking about leadership, whether that's your staff, get full context. Whether that's your biblical theology, if you're talking about church, get full context. So I would really urge people to listen.
Yeah.
before
Well,
they
and the Bible also talks about measuring the accuracy of what somebody's saying by how much it agrees with the written word. And so I think the main difference is being critical of an individual versus being critical of an idea. And it kind of goes right back to what we were talking about at the beginning. It's that we consistently hold each other accountable by what's in the Bible. There are people that I've talked to that I really trust, but I have had theological disagreements with them. They've, tried to reference the scripture, and I said, that is 100% not what that passage means. You know what I mean? And it's like, I'm not writing off our friendship. I'm not calling you stupid. I'm saying the idea that you're telling me is not correct. It's not biblically founded. You can try and twist it however you like, and you can do what you're going to do, and I can't stop you. But I'm telling you that is not true. But it's a criticism of the idea. It's a criticism of the false gospel that's being proclaimed, but it's not an assumption of the intention, because I have to assume that the person that I love and trust is trying to apply the Bible to their lives. And I think that is a noble thing. I will, however, say that it's a misapplication and that it should be corrected. But I'm never at that point in time belittling the person or damaging the relationship that I have with them, because that's far more valuable.
You said something important there. And you said the phrase of, you're talking about you said basically false gospel. So what whenever we're talking about gospel in this sense, people think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Other people think the entire Bible from, I want to say Torah, but for people who don't know that, Genesis through Revelation. And then you got a lot of people out there who may have additional books in there as well. So what do you mean by the term false gospel?
Yeah, well, you take the Gospels, the book, or I guess the books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, so named because they're of the life of Jesus, but the word gospel is the good news. And to me, that is the entirety of the Bible, because it's a selective text of salvation history, of the fall and creation. So why do we need Jesus, into the final redemption of humanity in the fallen world, and revelation of hey, sorry, I broke this, and like, okay, I fixed it. You know what I mean? That's the gospel. It's the truth of the revelation of the need for and the life of Jesus Christ. Anything else, I think, is kind of an offshoot of that. You would argue later in the New Testament, we have kind of the post-life of Christ, but I would say that the Holy Spirit came to continue and complete the work of Christ. That's a whole other topic. We can talk about that another time if you want. But
if that's biblical.
By the gospel, I just mean, what is the Bible saying? And whenever we have something that does not align with, does not agree with, does not meet the intended meaning of a passage or doctrine, then we have a false gospel.
Mm-hmm. So for people that may not know, there's two things, like, right, whenever you look at, for example, there's a huge debate around the Constitution of the United States between context and what it actually says and whether it applies to today. And that's a whole thing. And I think the Bible is people have a very similar conversation around that. So whenever we're talking about if it's based on what the Bible says, are we talking about word for word? Are we talking about within context? Are we talking about for the day it's in, but that's different today? How do we break down which text we're relying on for firm do this because it says it in black and white or in red and white, as opposed to which text we do because it's contextual?
Yeah. Well, now you're talking hermeneutics, right? It's figuring out what type of text it is. So is it poetry? Is it prose? Is it a psalm? Is it directed towards God? Is it directed towards a listener? Is it a narrative? Is it a proverb that's different from a psalm? Is it apocalyptic literature, which I promise you never, ever, ever interpret that literally? That is a hard line for me, because it's intentionally written to be misleading to anyone except for those who have the exact correct historical and cultural background understanding. So it's written for a group of people that would only be able to interpret it under certain specific examples. And even then, in Revelation, you have John on the Isle of Patmos, and he's just kind of, I don't know. I think he talks about a television at some point. Like, it's, he's kind of off the deep end as far as like anyone really being able to truly interpret it for what it says.
So why would God put them in there?
It's his revelation of himself. I can't speak to his intention and to the things that he would like for us to know, but I know that he chose for those things to be known to some extent. But then you have even, Jesus, who I would say Paul's the most literal. Jesus speaks with a lot of figures of speech. Jesus speaks with a lot of, I would go so far as to say sarcasm and humor. There are moments where it's in the Gospels and he's trying to reiterate a point for the sake of the disciples. And it says Jesus sighed deeply within his spirit. And I think that phrasing is very, very funny. It's like Jesus is fed up. You know what I mean? It's like he's exasperated. How many times do I have to tell you the same thing? And you have to, I think, take a measure of the conversation. And he says things like, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, but how can you physically measure the size of faith? You know what I mean? So we know it's figurative because it's impossible to physically measure faith at all. So it's something very, very small, a very, very small amount of faith. So it's like, read it for what it means rather than what it says is what I would say.
I think, just going back to what I asked you, I think that about why did God put like revelation in the Bible if we're not meant to really understand the concepts in there. I think that's why it's in there. I think God wanted us, if we could understand every single piece within the Bible, then how is it above our knowledge? It's not that he's hiding things from us, but I think it's the realization of you're human and there was a fall. And because of that, your brain doesn't understand all of these concepts. But within that, like realize that there's peace. And I think that's, it's not to like hide anything again, but it's to establish for people, like you said, there's difference between Psalms and Proverbs and what the context is being taken into account of who it's being spoken to. And I think that's why Revelation is in there, because if you didn't have kind of Revelation or parts of, I believe it's Daniel, that are really just completely different than the rest of the Bible, really don't make a whole lot of sense, it wouldn't feel complete. And you're like, well, it doesn't feel complete because it doesn't make sense. Well, the fact that it's in there means that there's a completion to all the facets of communication with somebody. You've got songs and talking, and then things that just sound wacky that are above your pay grade kind of concepts. And the reason for that is completion. At least that's
No, I totally agree with you. I've often said any God that I can fully comprehend isn't worth my time. Because if I can fully understand, I can fully compartmentalize you, you're not God. You're not big enough. And so it's just one of those things that for a lot of people, it's a stumbling block. For me, it's a reassurance because the God that I believe in is a God that's too big for me to understand. Is a God that's too big for me to wrap my mind around. And so that gives me a little bit of confidence that I'm serving the right God. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, that leads us into the purpose of the podcast, and that is leadership and capacity. And I think that that's a great way to go into our great segue here. Whenever we're talking about leadership and what the purpose and true leadership is it's not control. It's not always standing at the front of a crowd and saying, this is what we're doing and being well known. But oftentimes it's about your capacity to endure and your capacity to hold things together and your capacity to listen. And sometimes I think a good leader knows when they've hit capacity, when they can't do anything else, when they've come up against a wall of sorts, or biblically, when you're reading the Bible and you're like, I know I can't understand this anymore. I think that's really telling of whenever a leader knows when enough is enough or when they need help. So we're going to break down what John Tozzi went through in the most recent episode and the PDF that we developed with him about really how to lead effectively and what are some key areas of that. Hey, I want to pause for just a second here. If you're listening to this while you're leading something, whether that's a business, a team, church, nonprofit, you're not here by accident. If this is helping you think clearer, lead better, I want you to take 2 seconds and share this with somebody who carries the same weight that you do. And don't forget to subscribe. So I think capacity is a great way to start and segue into it. Do you have any thoughts, Sam, on capacity and leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember I was talking to just this last Sunday. So I've been working as part-time interim worship pastor for a church, and they found a full-time guy. So I spent some weeks kind of handing over the program to him. This is what they do. Most of it was just like, this is where things are at. Do whatever you want from here. And he was talking to me. He had just come back from doing missions for 14 or 15 years. South Africa. And he was saying a conversation that he had with the lead pastor at that church was, I don't know that we've ever taken off more than 2 weeks at a time in all these 14 years. And basically leading that into a conversation about how aware he became of the need for stepping back, of the need for taking time for oneself in ministry and in like university areas. You'll see that called like sabbatical. You take time so that you can be your best self. And to me, in a university, like a professor will get a sabbatical because it's essential that anyone who's teaching continue their own education. And a more spiritual sense, that's how I see it in ministry. It's that anyone who's pouring out has to have a source. And so you can be reading your Bible and praying on a regular basis. And I know that the key is always to read for yourself and then preach out of what you call like maybe the overflow or whatever you want to, what label you want to put on that. But it becomes a real challenge to make a hard line between, am I studying to preach or am I studying to understand? And until you kind of put yourself in a position where you can just be a Christian, you're not a pastor, it's challenging to perpetuate your faith on a long-standing basis. And so it's really important that you know what your signs are for, hey, I'm getting close to burnout. Like for me, it is, I'm not wanting to go outside, I'm not wanting to talk to people, and I stop like cleaning up after myself around the house. Like the bed doesn't get made, like dishes don't get away. Like it's just the little things that if I can't like bring myself to do the smallest thing around the house, I'm like, something's about to break. You know what I mean? Like I've got to do some maintenance. I've got to set some time aside to where, I'm spending more time praying or more time like meditating or whatever that looks like for me, whatever I need to recharge. But I'm aware of kind of my, what I would call personal markers of like, you're really approaching burnout. Maybe it's like your patience gets a little shorter, or maybe it's like you don't eat as well, or you're only ordering Taco Bell on DoorDash, like whatever it looks like for you, everybody has those markers. And so for a leader to recognize their capacity is enormous. And then one step beyond that is to recognize, what does it take to keep myself at full capacity, or what does it take to restore amount of capacity that's been lost?
Yeah, that's good. Well, because whenever you boil it down to capacity within leadership, it is emotional and it is mental. I mean, that's really it. You can always have a team member do something. You can always hire more staff to do something. But for a leader, the biggest weight is emotional and mental capacity. Knowing when you need to divvy some of that up or pause and what you're working on to refresh is huge. If you are not self-aware, I mean, everything's going to fall apart. You can maybe put some band-aids on it for a while, but you have to have some self-awareness in order to move forward. Yeah, I think capacity is probably the biggest thing, and understanding when you've hit it. Know what your markers are, what you just said. Know where your markers are for when you've hit capacity. And so in this PDF download that we have for people, we talk about some things that they can do are to identify one standard that you enforce and ask yourself, have I already explained why it matters and how it protects the team? So your capacity is even so much so dictating or affirming what your team can and can't handle. And you have to know your team in order to do that. You can't just have a team member there and say, okay, we're going to do all these things, and your team member doesn't want to disappoint you. So they say, yeah, sure, I can do that for you. You need to create a culture where they can say, hey, I've reached it. This isn't because I don't want to do the work. It's just because I myself can't do it. And you have to model that first. You can't just assume your team's going to do it and you yourself not as well. So I would say for leaders that are listening to this is self-evaluate, spend some time and write down the things that make you happy and that make you passionate, and then write down the things that you're fully doing right now. So let's say that you're writing your sermons. Let's go for church. You're writing for your sermons, you're managing your time clocks for whatever reason between your people. You're maybe doing your planning center because you haven't let that out yet to somebody else. And you might be like looking at your books and fundraising. So within those four things, find out do you like doing any of them? Maybe sermons is the only thing you like. If those other three things you're not really passionate about, circle them and create an action plan to figure out how you're going to do it. Go to your staff and say, hey, these are things that are draining my time to be the best version of myself for you and for the mission on church. Is there anybody that can help step in? And if they say, no, we can't, then you need to figure out, what does this look like?
Yeah. And we've got like another little workshop tool that helps you look at what does it mean and how do I get from A to B when it comes to systemizing things in the church. So we'll like 30-day, step by step checklist, one per day. It's really easy to follow. And it's just, how do I figure out who's doing what they're not good at, what they don't enjoy, hand that over to somebody who is good at it and does enjoy it, and systemize that so that it can be repeated if anybody's missing. Yeah, definitely a big part of leadership is understanding, am I doing what's actually important? Am I doing what nobody else can do? If you're doing something somebody else can do, don't do it. Because if you're doing something that somebody else can do, you're not effectively leading. You're not focusing on the things that nobody else can do, which is why you're there. Anybody on the team, for the most part, is there because they offer something that somebody either A, doesn't have the time for, or B, can't do. And so you're hiring based on need for the team. And so if you're the leader and you're doing things that like an executive pastor or an associate pastor or a youth pastor or worship pastor, kids pastor, if there's somebody else on your team that can do it, let them do it so that you can do the things that they can't do, which most of the time is just leading the team. I guess that you said something that kind of helps us get into the next point, which is like knowing your team, knowing them on a personal basis, and understanding that not everybody can be led the same way. And that takes individual relationship. Because if I, were to talk to, again, I'm picking on my sister a little bit. When we were kids, I could joke with her and be like a little bit, I always say my love language is gentle bullying. Like if I don't tease you, like we're not really friends. And with my little sister, I could kind of like gently bully her, and we would, be like, ha 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 ha, so funny. But I noticed after a lot of trial and error, if I tried to behave that same way with her when there were other people around, she would get very defensive and very embarrassed because she thought that maybe like it was damaging her image in front of the group. And so I was like, okay, that's just like me and her hanging out time, kind of joking around. But I only knew that because I spent time with her. You know what I mean? I only knew that because I was with her in different environments, and I knew what stressed her out, and I knew what her boundaries were. And as a leader, you have to know who can respond to what type of leadership, who needs encouragement, who needs a little bit of tough love. And I think that like that is only going to be viable, again, if you're keeping capacity for that to be something that you can do. And maybe it doesn't look like work to anybody else, but if you're intentionally spending time with certain staff members so that you can get to know them, so that you can lead them more effectively, that's 100% work, and somebody else can do the scheduling for planning center. You know what I mean? Like there are things that you can hand off for sure.
Oh, 100%. It's all about trust. I mean, at the end of it, you got to be able to trust your people, but the only way you can trust somebody is if you know them. We talked about this earlier. Like there is a level of trust, but you have to also verify. And the only way you verify is by knowledge. And you have to get in there with them and understand what makes them excited. It's not even the trusting because you think somebody's doing something wrong. It's trusting because you want to make sure that they're happy. And I think it's a posture of your heart, of your intention behind why you're leading. Are you leading in order to meet a goal financially? Are you leading in order to get your name out there? Are you leading to grow the church? Are you leading to help people? If you're leading to help people, the fundamentals are the same. Care about others, communicate, get to know them, and really make sure that overarching the vision everybody's behind. So there's always going to be a different vision per organization. And once you get to know your people, make sure they align with that vision. And if you realize that somebody doesn't align with your vision or the vision of the organization, it's not bad to let them go or to say, hey, we're going to part ways, because it means that they're not going to fully be realized and flourish there. They need to go somewhere else. So help them explore what that looks like. I wouldn't say just fire somebody or let them go immediately, but say, hey, I know that you're really passionate about, youth soccer, but you happen to be a Christian. Is there an organization out there that would fit better for than here? Because here we're really about, growing the elderly population and making sure that they're safe before they, go on to pass away. There's very different organizations, and just because you have a good heart to help people doesn't mean that you're always in the right spot. So making sure that the people under you, that you can trust them, that they trust you to even say and have that conversation, but you have to know them first. So I think that's a really valid point. So I think going into the next one, which would be about work-life balance, which is one of my favorite topics to discuss because it's
so tough for ministers, this topic.
It's so tough. It's so tough. Ministers, oh man, huge. Small business, even business, anybody in a leadership capacity that is responsible for other people, if they have a good heart, it's hard for them.
Mm-hmm.
If all they care about is money, it's also hard for them. Both sides eat into your life. But I think we hit on church for a second. We hear a lot about people saying, and I've heard this phrase so many times from people. And it's like, well, I'm building the kingdom. It's all about kingdom impact, and I'm building the kingdom. So we're going to have to sacrifice some stuff. And it's hurt.
To which reply, who do you think you are? Like, do you think honestly, like, just open up with me here. Do you think that you are capable of building the kingdom?
Yeah. Unless you're the
You know,
Pope.
dude, not even the Pope, dog. Not even the Pope built the kingdom. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, it's a version of C.S. Lewis has this thought. He says, if God forgives us, we ought to forgive ourselves as well. Otherwise, we set ourselves up as a higher tribunal than him. In other words, if we are forgiven by God and refuse to forgive ourselves, we're putting ourselves in a place of higher authority than God. And so it's like what it comes down to at the end of the day, and this is a hard pill to swallow, and I know because I've wrestled with it in enormous amounts on my own. It comes down to pride. It comes down to how much do you really think that you can do? Do you honestly think that you can do anything without God, A, or anything in the place of God, B, or C, anything that God can't do with anybody else? And it's like God chooses people to work with, does whatever he wants to do. God does what only he can do. And it is then our responsibility to do what he's asked of us, which is to steward our people under us, to steward ourselves, and to look to the future and make ourselves available for callings that he would put upon our life and things that he would ask of us. But if we're not taking the time to ensure that we're in the best possible position to answer the call, it's the parable of the virgins with oil and those without. It's that there's a time and there's a need, and there are some that are prepared because they've taken time to fill up their lamps, and there are others who are unprepared because they have not taken the time to fill up their lamps. The wedding party's coming, the Lord's coming, and they're not in a position to be part of the wedding party. And so it's enormously difficult for people to identify that. And I don't say that critically. I don't say that of stupid idiot. You know what I mean? I don't mean it like that. I mean, like, it's important that you recognize where your faults are. It's important that you recognize what you can do and what you can't do, more importantly. And if what you can do is take care of yourself so that you're available to be an instrument for the Lord in times that, that you may or may not be aware of, then that's the most important thing you can do. You know what I mean? If there's a step that we have to take before we can do what God's asking us to, then that right now is the most important thing we can do.
It's about being present where you're at 100%.
Yeah. As our friend John Tazi liked to say, be where your boots are. It's like you can only do what you can do. You can only be where you're at. And so take full advantage of where you're at. Do all the things that you can do while you're there, and then be ready to move on. It's just a matter of appropriate order. And I think sometimes people with the best intentions tend to get so far ahead, get so far into like, what can I be doing? What is it that needs to be done? What can I do right now is kind of the neglected question.
Yeah. I would challenge people to reflect on where exactly there are moments in your week that you find it really hard to be present. So I would say for most leaders, it's when they're home. They find it really hard to be fully present while they're at home because it's an email that needs to be checked. It's a budget that they've been working on really hard, and it affects everything if they don't get it right. If they're in church, it could be, some really tragic event that happened with a staff member in their lives that's just weighing on you. There's a lot of reasons that it's hard to be present at home, but it's also vice versa too. Sometimes it could be hard to be present whenever you're in work because you have so much going on, or you are really struggling with stuff in your personal life that's bleeding into your affected ministry or other things that you're working on. So find time, like just really evaluate if you're listening to this, just take some time even now, just pause the video, stop and evaluate. Are you even listening to this? Or are you thinking about other things? Are you watching this podcast while you're working on a budget? Are you doing this while you're answering emails? I'm not saying you have to listen to us fully right now, but I'm saying that it's an example of how our brains are just wired to take in a ton of information, but we're not wired to output the same quality at that level. So whenever you're taking in 200% information, you can't output 200% information. Most of the time, what ends up happening is you take in 200, you retain about 20% of that, and then you end up executing on like 5 of it. And so then everything just starts to slowly eat away at you. And then once you do that, find a space that makes it easy for you to be present and go there. So it's a coffee shop. A lot of people do closets, which is an interesting thing. Psychology, you could go into that, like going into a closet. The Bible is really, I think that's the purpose of the cave that David went into as well, is getting away from the noise around people who supported him and finding time to reevaluate what's happening and repurpose. And when you come out of that time, you can execute a whole lot better and a lot clearer minded. I think it was right after David did that, or during that time while he was in there, he had the opportunity to kill Saul, and he didn't because his mind was able to be stilled and think about what is the bigger picture here. So just because you have the opportunity to make a decision while you're being distracted doesn't mean that you should, even if it feels right in the moment. So you remove your emotion, pause, and act.
Yeah. One of the biggest things that was like such a game changer for me mentally, emotionally, and really just being able to apply myself more effectively was when I started practicing meditation on a regular basis. And I know if I say meditation, it feels like new agey. I don't mean like sitting in repose and saying ohms and trying to open up my third eye and align my chakras. What I mean is there are practices that you can take that help you to focus your mind and control your attention more effectively. And it's most of the time, it's just as simple as on purpose, neglecting everything else around you and focusing purely on your breath. And you do that for 10 or 15 minutes. And I know that sounds like a long time. When you get into it, you get into like kind of a flow state. The time flies by. And legitimately, if I do that and I take the time to kind of slow down and allow myself to breathe, I'll come out of it feeling like I took a 2 or 3 hour nap, because it's just your mind is so exhausted running, trying to catch up with all the things that it thinks it ought to be doing, that it doesn't have any more fuel. And if you just literally take a minute to let it quiet, it goes miles and miles. And it really has, I mean, it has benefits elsewhere in life. It has benefits in your emotional regulation and your attention span and your processing abilities and your awareness of your environment. Like it has all these other long reaching effects if you do it regularly. But in the short term, what it really does is help you kind of allow yourself to let go of all the things that are around you that you can't control for the sake of focusing in on things that you can control and moving in that direction. And so I know a lot of people kind of get like edgy in the Christian world when they hear practicing meditation, but it's really not weird, I promise. But it's a very, very beneficial practice.
But yeah, definitely. I think what meditation allows you to do is to remove the chaos from your world, is what you're saying. And it allows you to think clear and act with singularity. It's very easy to not have singularity in what you're doing because you're always pulled in a lot of directions. And with that, it can move into, and what we're hitting on really in the core of what we've just been talking about is, we started at the beginning talking about this, is that leadership is very emotional. Your capacity is mental and physical drain on your body and how you approach people. There's a lot of care that goes into that, especially if you're in a mission driven organization like a church, a nonprofit, or even a social business. There's a lot of care that goes into that. And even just for some people that aren't maybe in that space, they still have good hearts. And so as a human, hopefully you're a good person and you do care about people, and you might struggle with discipline at the same time. And so discipline can be disciplining yourself, which is meditation, like you're talking about. Could be disciplining a team. I'm trying to figure out what is, and whenever I say discipline, I don't want it to feel like we're spanking a child on the butt kind of discipline here.
Stay disciplined for punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And where punishment is kind of a rebuke for wrongdoing, discipline, I always think of it as more of a boundary. And we put up boundaries to protect things that are valuable. And so if you want to live longer, you want to be more mobile, you want to be able to do things with your kids, and your grandkids, and to your older age, you exercise and you prioritize dieting and what you take in, because you want to, just in your body so that it has more to give for a longer period of time. And that applies to, I think, where you're talking about in a team setting. Disciplining is just pruning practices that are not beneficial. It is sometimes doing things that are uncomfortable or unpleasant for the sake of long-term benefits.
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly it. And that's our, the fourth point in that PDF file that we have for you. And it's the difference between discipline and care and how culture is built through that. It has to be a balance. Discipline, without care creates resentment because you always feel like you're boxed in. You always feel like you can't do things. But care without discipline will create chaos because there's always emotion being driven and emotion-led decisions. You have to then, as a leader, decipher when there's a time to set a boundary and when there's a time to cross the boundary that you've had in place. The old phrase, rules are meant to be broken. It's not true, but rules are there to keep you focused. Disney has a great phrase about this, and they say that you can be off task and on purpose. And I think that that goes into pretty much any organization, but specifically churches.
It's just interpersonal leadership. It's very important because it's like you can, I don't know, it's the whole Martha Mary thing. I'm a Martha. I like to make sure that the tasks are done, but when you're leading people, it's really important that the people be more important than the tasks. You know, that like it can feel like an interruption, but that's the work. I think
Yeah.
that's what you're saying.
Yeah, I remember when I was first told that. Actually, my wife was the first person who told me that phrase, which is you can be off task and on purpose, and it really changed the way that I approach pretty much every decision I make now. Is yeah, this might not be on task today, but if it's on purpose, then it's okay. Ritz Carlton has a whole thing about that. I believe every employee has access to about $20,000 to make a decision on. So because it's a high end brand, if there's a guest who is unhappy, they have about $20,000 to spend before they have to go ask, which is pretty wild. But the purpose of that, the purpose of that is because they're all about hospitality and care, and they know that that's their purpose. So spending an extra 20 grand is not on task with a budget. It doesn't make sense to do that. And also, if you're talking about the Ritz Carlton in particular, it might look like giving somebody an extra night for free and like an executive suite, which can run 20 grand up a night, but it's on purpose. The brand is important to them. The care for the customer is important to them. Retaining that customer value is important. In a leadership position for church, you talk about fundraising, for example, is you want to retain the lifetime value of your donor and your member. And how you do that is by instilling purpose into them and refocusing their value to the organization. And it's not financial, it's purpose driven, it's movement driven. Yeah. So if you're in that state of trying to figure out what decision do I make, know your purpose, and then know the cost of that decision. And if it falls within a healthy boundary of that, you can allow a little bit of care and chaos to make the decision and go that route, and just know that it has to align with the purpose of what you're doing. But don't be afraid to step out of a boundary that you've set for the fear of your team not seeing you as firm in your decisions. I think a lot of leaders feel like if they tell their team one thing and then they pivot the following week, that they feel like they've let their team down, or they feel like they can't go against whatever policy they just put in place or whatever direction they just said. But if you've created a culture that your team understands that sometimes we do things that are for the greater purpose of the organization and for the call that's on our, they'll get behind it. If you can explain the why almost every single time, their team will get behind whenever you can't. So being able to balance discipline and care is huge, because it really is the crux of, I think, every leadership decision that you'll come across. How you determine your budget for the year. What's our budget goals? What's our financial plan?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the idea that you're kind of pushing is, when the Bible says it, that mercy triumphs over justice. And I think that a lot of leaders see that if they're not firm in their decision making, they'll be seen as weak or wishy-washy. But the truth is quite the opposite, I think, unless they have like a long history of being kind of flaky or indecisive. Most employees would admire the fact that they're willing to be flexible and kind of move things around for the sake of personnel and for the sake of the purpose that we're talking about here, right? It's like the people have to be more important than the system. And I think it's kind of hard for us to wrap our heads around because we have a very legislative culture of like the rules are the rules. You know, in my mind and in most places in the world, the well-being of people is more important than holding up the rules for just like the sake of holding up the rules. You know, like the rules are there to keep people safe and to keep things in order. Sometimes the rules are less important than the occasion. You know what I mean? It's like, in any movie, somebody does something wrong. They're like, oh, let them off. It's Christmas. You know what I mean? Or, my wife and I were watching Anger Management, and Mayor Giuliani steps up, even though Adam Sandler was running around the Yankee Stadium trying to find his girlfriend in the crowd, which, you know, it's a crazy proposition. If you've been to a professional baseball game, like 0% chance you're actually finding that person. And Mayor Giuliani's like, let him speak. It's like, hey, we're bending the rules. I feel like this is a more important occasion. And everybody's cheering Mayor Giuliani because he's like, oh yeah, he's not, you know, following the rules, but he's doing something that he's, you know, feels is more important or more correct to do. And I think kind of you and I tend to, I think, discuss ideas more with like a sawed-off shotgun than with a sniper rifle, you know, just like a very broad focus. But I think a thing that we wanted to kind of talk about is that a healthy leader outlasts a talented one. And so when it comes to the discipline that we're discussing here, it's for the sake of longevity, it's more important that you observe disciplines, that you observe healthy practices, whether, talk about meditation or talking about knowing your markers for burnout. And those are the things that you're going to need to be able to do. And any person who prioritizes that is going to last longer than the person who speaks really well, or the person who knows the answer to all the questions, or the person who is just really funny. You know what I mean? It's like those people are going to, sway about if they're working purely on their talent because they don't have any deeper essence to them. They don't have anything that goes beyond that talent. But a person who does the deeper work, who cultivates the practices that are not as easy to come by, that person's going to last longer.
Yeah. Well, we kind of hit into our next topic here, which was metrics without morality will undermine you. And it's kind of what we're talking about here. So let's just jump into that too. Is that essentially if all you're basing your decisions on are the metrics involved, you better make sure that those metrics are what's really going to move the needle forward. I would say more often than not, money is not the metric that you're basing your decisions on. And it's not to say that money is not important, because we've hit on this before. Like that's really what I focus on most of the time with organizations is growing revenue. But as a leader, you have to have the care of the people in mind first, of who you're leading. Not just that you're impacting, but the people of who you're leading have to be important to you. And if you're leading a good and well developed organization, those decisions will equate to better revenue as you go on. You might have a little bit of a stagnant year or drop in year, but you'll figure out what to do with that. But it's important to treat the people through that process with care and morality, and have a clear, I would say even have a boundary on your morality to make sure you don't cross a line there and go the opposite direction whenever things get hard. I think we're seeing we talk about this too, is that in the last 2 years within the nonprofit and church space, we have seen a lot of turmoil, whether you're talking about just political turmoil, social turmoil, or just financial fundraising turmoil. Fundraising has been down. If you're a church, you know this. Fundraising has been a struggle for the last 2 years. American giving is down. I don't remember the percents off the top of my head. If I find them, I'll throw them on here or put them in the comments or something. But fundraising has been down across the board, religious and non-religious nonprofits. Just fundraising, people aren't giving. They're just not doing it as much as they used to. And it used to be that consumer spend metrics kind of mirrored fundraising metrics. They were pretty similar. And now it's not, the last 2 years haven't really equated to that. And I think some of it's due to lack of trust in nonprofits. Some of it is due to cultural shifts on what it means to give money away to others, as well as I think a lot of nonprofits aren't connected with the new generations coming up, and they haven't established care for the donor. They've become really focused on how do we keep our lights on? How do we make more missional impact, which is great, but it's the people that are helping you get there that want to be taken care of as well. So just tying that back to the point of your metrics are important, but your morality is also there. So make sure that you are taking care of the people who are making it happen. PBS Kids is a really good slogan, which is brought to you. It's brought to you by viewers like you. Everybody, if you watch PBS Kids and grew up on that, you probably have that memorized. You hear it's nostalgic. It's part of our American culture forever.
That happens the plug for Juicy Juice. 99% real juice. So that happens right before the plug for Juicy Juice, 99% real juice.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. That's right. Right behind it. Yeah. Those two are like pivotal for anybody that grew up in the last 30 years in America. But they did a really good job of that for a long time because people felt connected. That one phrase just drives so much feeling of connection with what you're watching, and be like, oh, I want to give. Like I'm putting this show on for my kids. I want to give to that. You mean you don't just have money coming in from ad revenue? I'll give to that. So there's a piece of that it invites the donor along the journey with you. And I just talk about fundraising for a second on that, because I think it's a huge piece for a lot of people that are watching this is how do we raise money? How do we get money in the door? And it's staying true to your morality of who you are as a person. Don't let money dictate your decisions, but use tactics to fundraise. But there's a balance. There's definitely a balance on that one. So I would say develop a system that helps you evaluate what your most important metrics are, depending on what quarter or season that you're in of your organization, your church. So if that metric is, let's say we're at Q4 end of the year, we're trying to hit maybe an extra 200 grand before the end of the year, and it's November, have a good game plan. And everybody needs to know that that's our goal. If we want to keep our jobs, that's our goal right now. So there's a timing for that. If it's the metric is missional impact, let's say we get to, a lot of times you'll see this happen in like January, February, beginning of the year. It's like, how are we going to create vision and drive missional impact so that we can do that through the rest of the year? Figure out what those metrics are. How are you going to hit that? What does it take to accomplish those goals? Uh, this probably would be helpful for a second if in a future episode we break down what your year fundraising or metrics should look like as a nonprofit or a church, with how you divvy up, like when do you focus on mission, when do you focus on people, when do you focus on uh funding. It should pretty much be inclusive throughout the year, but there are times of the year that you're going to have to focus on that because not everything goes as planned or as perfectly as you'd like it to. But once you figure out what your metric is, what's the most important thing in your leadership right now that you can focus on, ask yourself, if we hit this goal but we lose trust, would it still be worth it? So that'd be the first thing I would ask. And then once you do that, adjust how your success is going to be defined afterwards. If you're like, yep, we're not going to lose trust, we'll be fine, then we'll be okay. That metric and that goal is probably still fine. If you're going to do it and you're going to lose trust through that process, the biggest thing that you have in any relationship is going to be trust. So anything that's going to make you lose trust with your team or your donor or whoever you're hitting missional impact with, it's not worth it. Trust is really important, which leads into our next topic, which is vulnerability builds trust faster than control.
Yes, that is a good point. Vulnerability builds trust faster than control. I think this is kind of like um, ruling versus leading, right? Like you can have the king who's born into the role, or you can have the king who's lifted up by the people. And the king who's lifted up by the people, his military presence in the city isn't going to be as important as the king who's born into the role. You know what I mean? You have to put a lot more systems in place to make sure that people are doing what you're saying. But if you lead with love and vulnerability and sacrifice for the sake of the people under you, your leadership is going to be much more effective than it will be if you're the kind of parent that says, because I said so. You know what I mean? If you can get people to understand the heart behind what you're doing, which requires vulnerability, it requires that you say, this is who I am. This is what's important to me. Sometimes it's saying, these are the mistakes that I've made. And 10 times out of 10, if I have somebody that I am working for and they say, hey, I messed up, I should have done this and I did that. And we're going to fix that now. We're going to do that instead of this. But I'm sorry, I messed up. I'm going to 100% respect that person more than the person I'm working for who will try and sweep that under the rug and, blame anybody under them who misinformed them or, whatever it might be that makes it somebody else's fault. I don't have any respect for that person, but the person who can, be vulnerable and say, this is my fault. It was, a lapsing judgment. It was a poor decision or I lost focus, whatever it was, you see it's a real person there and you're like, oh, okay. Yeah. That's somebody I want to work for. That's somebody I want to be behind.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I think you brought up a good point about the king there. And I think we could go back to a story in the Bible between the difference. When you look at kings in the Bible, you could see David, or I believe Josiah is the other king. And if I'm not mistaken, could be wrong. Sam, you can correct me here. But Josiah was 8 when he became king, and David was basically like 8 when he was anointed, and then took forever to become king.
Yeah,
He's like,
probably early teen years, but yeah,
he's
there's
a
a long
child.
time.
And you see a very. I was talking to my mother-in-law actually about this the other day. She brought it up because we went and saw the new David movie, which is amazing if you haven't seen it. But we're talking about David and his life and Josiah and she was like, man, David gets so much like credit in the Bible. And she's like, Josiah gets like nothing. And she's like, David had tons of mess ups the entire time he was king. And Josiah is like, the Bible is like pretty, for most part, they're like, yeah, he's perfect. He didn't have any issues. He was a great king. Everybody loved him. Great king. And then David's like adultery, just lost his way a couple times. And then God's like, you can't build the temple, the whole deal. And it's just like, well, how do those line up here? Why are we giving credit to somebody who like failed so much as a leader as opposed to somebody who's, basically grown up in it? And she's like, her concept was like, that person who grew up in it, like they had way more opportunities to misuse or abuse power because they grew up in that. They don't know anything different. And so I just thought that was an interesting conversation to bring up. And I think sometimes it shows that your leadership is not always, and how you become an effective leader and a good leader, and your legacy is not necessarily always dependent on your upbringing. It's not always dependent on sometimes your experiences, but it's how you approach the situations as they come and how you lead within that. David messed up a lot, but was really vulnerable in front of God, and he had a heart after God. That ability to we see, I think it's just the Bible really just opens up about the shortcomings in his life, because I think it gives us an insight into we don't have to be. There's a call on your life, and it doesn't mean you have to be perfect. And I could just stop there. Honestly, like just because you make a mistake as a leader doesn't mean that you're done. I mean, even whenever you're a perfect leader, doesn't mean that everybody's going to remember who you are. So stop trying to be so perfect. Stop trying to do everything exactly right and just do the next right thing you know to do. You hit on this a little bit earlier, and that's a phrase that I really live by as well. Is you may not always know what you're doing, but you know what's right now. And that comes down to a refocus of your purpose behind your decision making. In business, for example, like I know that I am not a video editor. Like I went through that the other day. I was like, I can do it. I don't love it. We had a conversation about that. I was like, I do not love video editing. Can I do it? Sure. Will I do it if I have to? Okay. But I don't love it. Other people, that's their thing.
Bless them.
God bless them. Not my thing. I
No.
can put up some good stuff, but I'm nowhere near as talented as some of the other people that love what they're doing. But it doesn't mean that and we go back to a little bit of the purpose. You can be off task and on purpose. My tasks are not to video edit, but it's on purpose for what we're working on. And knowing that not everything has to be so cookie cutter in your leadership, but be vulnerable and allow people to see that. Be honest about what's going on in your life with your community with some discretion, but be honest about what you need to be honest about, and don't try to hide things whenever you're going through something hard. People will follow somebody who's vulnerable and real. They will follow people who are not real for a time, but that'll eventually dry up. So vulnerability and trust. I mean, the only way to really build a team and a culture where people want to be a part of it is to have trust.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'd say that when you're a leader, you're always going to carry a ton of weight. That's just welcome to leadership. You're here. Welcome to the club. So it's going to carry weight. And the goal of being a good leader isn't to figure out ways to remove the weight. And we talk a lot about offloading, and delegating to a team. But the purpose isn't to get rid of what you're carrying. It's to carry it well and to bring people along that can help further what the calling on your life is. There's a lot of trust that has to be built in order to do that well. And you can't build that trust through control, but you can build it through being vulnerable and by caring about the people around you and by giving them boundaries, allowing them to know how far we want to go on certain tasks. How far do we want to push the boundary to accomplish what we feel is the call of God in our lives? And there does come a point where you can push past that to the point of breaking somebody. And as a leader, it's really important that you stop and pause and don't allow that to happen. It happens way too often in the church. Countless stories that I know that we could share and have people come on and talk about. But as a leader, it's your job to protect people. It's your job to figure out the balance between discipline and care. It's your job to figure out how to distill the vision for the organization into fundamental best practice steps for your team, and then give them the tools and the systems to execute well. If you're struggling with that, which we all do, find us at ostrom.com. We have some resources for you. I talked about earlier, there's a PDF download that helps you evaluate where you're at over the course of 30 days and where your team's at, and some holes and how to fix that, how to fill those gaps. And if you get done with that 30-day worksheet and you still are not super clear on what that looks like and how to implement it, just send us an email, DM us on Instagram or YouTube, wherever you're listening, and we'll be happy to talk and maybe help you get some clarity or just be a listening ear for what you're going through. As leaders, we all need an ability to be heard with things that we feel like we can't share. We don't want to burden those that are around us with. But we really do appreciate you taking time to listen to this podcast. We hope it was insightful and beneficial for you. And we're really excited to see where you go and how you develop your organization that you're in. And if you got anything out of this, we'd love to hear it. Just comment below something that you took away for the Done by Thursday podcast. Hopefully this helped you get some stuff done by Thursday.
Yeah, absolutely. We always talk about our passion is doing all the things that make ministry difficult beyond the ministry itself. So it's the operations, the accounting, whatever those things look like that are a hindrance to the actual ministry or whatever that mission might be in a nonprofit or for-profit setting, whatever it is that's kind of bogging you down and preventing you from actually achieving what it is that you're wanting to do, the things that are kind of interrupting your vision and your mission. Those are the things we want to help you sort out.
Hey, before you go, here's what we're actually building here. Done by Thursday isn't just a podcast. This is a place for leaders who are tired of theory and want clarity that they can act on. This show is produced by Ostrom, and we partner with founders, executives, pastors, and organizations to bring structure and strategy and direction to whatever you're carrying. If you want to go deeper, whether that's leadership clarity, strategic help, or just want a better way forward, find us at ostrom.com and subscribe if this mattered.